Dear listeners, welcome to the Deep Journal channel. By subscribing to our channel, you can be informed about detailed reports every time. The conflict tension in Syria is increasing day by day. Syria is home to many countries and many militant groups. The USA is in the region both to protect Israel from Iran and to end terrorist groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But the consequences of the conflict between Iran and Israel are hurting the US military. Israel may have many reasons to attack Iran or Iran to attack Israel, but Iran knows that when it attacks Israel, it will be met with a very harsh military operation. As a result of this, Iran-backed militant groups are attacking US bases in Syria due to the US's moderate attitude towards Iran. The US Army regularly carries out operations against members of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria. Last Wednesday, ISIS killed 10 workers by ambushing the bus of civilian oil workers working in the US-controlled Deir ez-Zor region. After this attack near the US base, the US airstrike fell on the agenda like a bomb. However, this airstrike was probably not a retaliation against ISIS, but rather a retaliation for the recent heavy attack by Iranian-backed militants on Al-Tanf and other American bases. But behind the US airstrike, there may be a major failure story. Iran has been trying to escape the great pressure that Israel has put on itself in recent days. On top of that, it seems to be putting pressure on the United States to return to the nuclear deals. In fact, the pressure that the United States should put into force, together with Iran's insidious attitude, strengthens Iran's hands. President Biden's soft stance on responding to Iran also puts this relationship in an even more dire situation. The air activities of the USA in the region had been going on for a very long time, but it was underlined that the most important issue for the US soldiers and the Pentagon was the civilian casualties. The US launched a major airstrike on Al-Qaeda on the 3rd of December. It has been reported that 3 missiles successfully hit their targets as a result of the attacks with the MQ-9 Reaper. It was also said that this attack was an intimidation to Iranian-backed militants. But the attacks proved to be a great failure. It was reported that 6 civilians were seriously injured and some of them lost their lives as a result of the attacks. The fact that civilians were affected by the attack caused a crisis in the Pentagon. Emergency rally plans were carried out immediately and it was stated that the loss of civilian lives was the most unacceptable thing. Iran, on the other hand, seems unaffected by this attack for now. In fact, anti-US groups and Iranian-backed militants in Syria may re-attack US bases, using these civilian casualties as an excuse. Iran-backed militants, who intensified their shipments especially in the central regions of Syria, are pleased that the United States is not included in Israel's incessant attacks. The Iranian-backed militants, who have not found any way of salvation from Israel's attack for now, do not seem likely to shelter in the region if the USA also starts their attacks. This is thought to be the reason why Iran is still holding talks in Vienna, even though it has no intention of returning to nuclear negotiations. The continuation of this abstention from the USA against Iran in Syria and the inability to protect their own bases also encourages other terrorist groups. There have been many attacks on US bases in the last month, and the continuation of this attitude may cause these attacks to increase and dare to do it in different groups. President Biden and the Pentagon should now take a clear stance towards Iran, like Israel, and take action to clear Iran-backed militants from the region instead of firing missiles at civilians in the region. Now let's examine details of US airstrike. Civilians may have been killed in a deck. 3 US airstrike against an Al-Qaeda leader by an MQ-9 Reaper drone in Syria, CENTCOM officials say. Civilians may have been killed in the latest U.S. drone strike against a senior Al-Qaeda leader and planner in Syria, officials from U.S. Central Command acknowledged. The Tampa, Florida-based command is investigating the incident, officials said. We abhor the loss of innocent life and take all possible measures to prevent them, said Navy Captain Bill Urban, CENTCOM's chief spokesman, in a statement about the deck 3 attack by an MQ-9 Reaper drone. The possibility of a civilian casualty was immediately self-reported to U.S. Central Command. We are initiating a full investigation of the allegations and will release the results when appropriate. The individual targeted was killed, Lieutenant Col. Karen Roxbury, a CENTCOM spokesperson, said. To protect intelligence sources and potential follow-on operations, we cannot release the target's name at this time, she said. Roxbury did not say how many civilian deaths or injuries may have resulted from the strike. We are in the immediate aftermath of the event and still conducting a thorough assessment, she said. We know of the potential for civilian casualties based on the self-report, but do not want to speculate. We are taking this matter seriously and will ensure that there is a comprehensive investigation. The command would not say whether such operations will pause during the investigation. This marks at least the third such attack against al-Qaeda leadership in Syria in recent months. News of potential civilian casualties comes just days after the Pentagon appointed a four-star general to investigate a deadly March 18, 2019, attack on ISIS in Baghouz, Syria, that killed 70 civilians, including women and youngs. Army Gen. Michael X. Garrett, head of Army Forces Command, has 90 days to review not only the strike itself, but how its results were investigated and briefed up the chain of command, Pentagon spokesman John Kirby told reporters November 29. He will review the reports of investigation already conducted into that incident and will conduct further inquiry into the facts and circumstances related to it, Kirby said, including the civilian casualties, compliance with the law of war, reporting procedures, whether lessons learned in previous investigations were implemented, whether discipline is recommended for those involved and whether any policies or procedures need an update as a result. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin ordered the review following a November 17 briefing, in which he mentioned both an internal and external review on U.S. airstrikes and civilian casualties. One is an annual requirement from Congress, while another is a RAND Corp. project on airstrikes in Raqqa, Syria, also during operations against ISIS. The announcement about the review into the Baghouz strike came fewer than 2 weeks after the Pentagon announced November 3 that it found no misconduct in a review of the August 29 drone strike in Kabul that mistakenly killed 10 civilians. After an initial review of U.S. airstrike killing an al-Qaeda leader in northern Syria wounded a family of 6, including a young who suffered serious head injuries. The Britain-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, an opposition war monitor, said the U.S. drone fired 3 missiles in Friday's attack, killing a former member of the al-Qaeda-linked Oris al-Din group. Oris al-Din are hardcore al-Qaeda members who broke away from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the strongest insurgent group in the Idlib enclave. The observatory said the man who was killed had left the group nearly a year ago, adding that he was a Syrian citizen from the northwestern region of Jabal al-Zawiya in Idlib province. It was not clear whether he was still a fighter. The Syrian Civil Defense confirmed in a statement on Friday that members of a displaced family were wounded in the strike. The day before the U.S. airstrike, ISIS terrorists attacked the oil workers in the U.S.-controlled Deir ez-Zor region, where the U.S. base is located. It is reported that the attack that killed the ISIS leader was a retaliation against this and also an intimidation to pro-Iranian militants. The Iranian-backed militants attacking Deir ez-Zor and al-Tanif U.S. bases in every opportunity. Oil workers killed in Islamic State attack in Syria. Syrian state media said on the 1st of December as terrorists ambushed buses carrying the employees in the eastern Deir ez-Zor province where U.S. military base located. Several oil workers were killed by the ISIS in eastern Syria at last Wednesday. IS ambushed 2 buses carrying the workers back from work in the Al-Qarada oil field in the southwest of the Deir ez-Zor province. 10 were killed and another was injured, Syria's official news outlet reported. IS lost its final territory in Syria in 2019, but continues to operate in the country. U.S.-led Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, and U.S. forces in Deir ez-Zor also hold thousands of IS in detention centers in northeast Syria. In October, an Iranian militia group calling themselves the Allies of Syria, launched 5 suicide drones at the only publicly acknowledged U.S. base in Syria, Al-Tanif, home to more than 200 troops. Thanks largely to a timely warning from Israel, there were no casualties. Noting that the attack was coordinated and deliberate, Central Command spokesman Captain Bill Urban said that the U.S. would respond, at a time and place of our choosing. Over 30 days later, that response has yet to come. Failing to respond to that attack places the thousands of U.S. forces in the Middle East at increased risk. This failure to act signals a lack of U.S. resolve. Worse, it invites further attacks on U.S. forces throughout the region. A small dusty base at a key road intersection in southeastern Syria, Al-Tanif is the center of U.S. efforts to train and support friendly Syrian militias. The drones attacking the base on October 20 reportedly carried a toxic mixture of high explosives, shrapnel and ball bearings. Only 2 of the drones exploded. The other 3 were examined and identified as Iranian-made. That forensic analysis later proved unnecessary, when Iran trumpeted the attack as a major success, and suggested more strikes will follow. Just a few days ago, it was reported the strike was ordered in response to Israeli airstrikes in Syria. Israel routinely strikes Iranian militia forces and facilities near its border with Syria to keep them from gaining a foothold there. But here's the problem. A U.S. official stated that the Iranians were reportedly reluctant to attack Israel for fear of retaliation. Let that sink in for a moment. The allies of Syria opted not to attack Israel because they knew such a move would result in an immediate reaction. Instead, they struck an American base. Today, there is much talk in Washington about deterrence. Most of those discussions revolve around China and Taiwan. Up for debate are questions such as whether it is better to be explicit in our intent to help defend Taiwan, or whether China could be deterred by tools such as diplomatic levers or economic sanctions. Failing to respond to that attack places the thousands of U.S. forces in the Middle East at increased risk and further weakens a reputation that is already in question after the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. Former Secretary of Defense James Mattis is remembered for saying he wanted the Marine Corps to exemplify the statement, "No better friend, no worse enemy." That is a worthy goal for the armed forces as a whole. It's past time to send a message that, if you attack a U.S. base, you will pay a price.